In the early months of 1843, a boy named Thomas arrived at a textile mill in Lancashire just before 5 in the morning. He was 9 years old. He carried nothing with him except the clothes he wore and a small cloth wrapped around a piece of bread his mother had cut for him the night before. The mill was already lit when he arrived. The gas lamps along the upper walls threw a dull yellow light across the floor, and the machines were being checked by the older workers before the first shift began. Thomas found his place near the spinning frames on the ground level, the same position he had worked for the past 7 months. He stood there for a moment, adjusting to the noise that began rising as more workers arrived and the machinery started to turn. Then he began his day. This is not a remarkable story. In 1843, it was ordinary. Tens of thousands of children across England, Scotland, and Wales were doing something similar that same morning. They were waking before dawn, walking to mills and mines and factories, standing at machines or crouching in spaces adults could not fit, and working for the better part of the day before walking home again. The work was often repetitive, the days were long, the pay was small, and the systems that placed them there had been building for decades, shaped by economics and industrialization, and a set of assumptions about childhood and labor that took a very long time to change. To understand how that world came to be, it helps to go back a little further, to a time before the large mills existed at all. In the decades before industrialization gathered full momentum, most textile production in England happened in homes. Families spun wool and wove cloth as part of a domestic arrangement known as the cottage industry. A weaver might work at a loom in the main room of his house, while his wife managed the spinning wheel and his children helped with carding, which was the process of combing raw wool into straight fibers ready for spinning. The work was woven into household routine. Children began helping when they were old enough to sit still and follow simple repetitive motions, which was usually around age 5 or 6. They worked alongside parents and siblings. The pace was set by the family rather than by an overseer or a factory clock. This arrangement had its own hardships. The work was constant, the income was often uncertain, and domestic weavers were highly vulnerable to changes in merchant prices. But the rhythms of the work were domestic rhythms. Children ate when meals were prepared. They were supervised by people who knew them, and the scale of the work was small enough that it could pause when it needed to. When the mechanized mills began appearing in the second half of the 18th century, the arrangement changed in ways that were gradual at first and then accelerating. The spinning jenny, invented in the 1760s, allowed a single worker to spin multiple threads at once. The water frame, developed around the same time, used water power to drive the spinning process at a speed and scale no hand spinner could match. Richard Arkwright's mill at Cromford in Derbyshire, which opened in 1771, became one of the early templates for what industrial textile production could look like. It employed hundreds of workers and ran continuously during daylight hours and sometimes beyond. Arkwright and the mill owners who followed him needed workers who could manage the specific tasks that mechanized spinning and weaving required. Many of those tasks were physically small. The machines had narrow gaps. The threads that broke needed quick fingers to repair them. Children were suited to the work in ways that adults were not. And children could be hired for less money. This combination made child labor not a byproduct of early industrialization, but a structural feature of it. The mills needed a steady supply of young workers, and the early solution to that supply problem came partly from the parish system. Parishes across England were responsible for the care of children who had no families to support them or whose families could not afford to keep them. These children were known as pauper apprentices. Under legislation that had existed since the Elizabethan era, parishes could apprentice poor children out to employers, and the employer would take responsibility for housing and feeding them in exchange for their labor. When the mills needed workers, mill owners approached parish authorities in London and other cities and arrangements were made to send groups of children north to work in the new factories. These pauper apprentices were typically between 7 and 14 years old. They traveled to the mills in batches, sometimes in carts, sometimes on foot over several days. On arrival, they were housed in dormitories attached to the mills, sometimes called apprentice houses. The quality of these accommodations varied considerably from one mill to another. Some mill owners made genuine efforts to provide adequate food, clean sleeping arrangements, and some basic instruction. Others viewed the children largely as units of labor and provided only the minimum necessary to keep them working. The children had little recourse in either case. They were bound to their employer by the apprenticeship agreement, and running away, which some did, was treated as a legal offense. The apprentice house at Quarry Bank Mill in Cheshire, which still exists and can be visited today, gives some sense of what these dormitory arrangements looked like. The building housed around 100 apprentices during the mill's early decades of operation. Children slept in shared beds, rose before the mill's first shift, ate in a common dining room, and worked the same hours as adult workers. The Greggs, who owned Quarry Bank, were considered relatively conscientious employers by the standards of the time. They provided schooling on Sundays and kept records of the children's health. But even in that relatively managed environment, the working day was long, and the children's time was almost entirely structured around the mill's needs. Not all pauper apprentices went to textile mills. Some went to brick kilns, glassworks, potteries, and other small manufacturers. The principle was the same regardless of the industry. The parish needed to place children who were a financial burden. The employer needed labor. The arrangement satisfied both, and the child's own preferences or capacities were rarely part of the calculation. By the early 19th century, the pauper apprentice system was already beginning to decline somewhat, partly because the mills had grown large enough that they could draw on the labor of local families directly. As industrial towns grew around the mills, workers moved in from surrounding rural areas and from other parts of the country, bringing their children with them. Families often depended on the wages of every member, including the youngest. A child of 6 or 7 who could work in the mill contributed to the family's income, and in households where wages were low and margins were thin, that contribution mattered. The parents who sent their children to work in mills and mines were not in most cases indifferent to their children's well-being. They were navigating economic circumstances that left them with very limited options. In communities where mill work was the main source of employment, refusing to send a child to work might mean the family could not pay its rent or buy enough food to get through the winter. The economy of the industrial working-class household required contributions from nearly everyone, and childhood as a period of protected development and schooling was a concept that applied primarily to families who could afford it. This is important to understand when looking at the history of Victorian child labor, because the moral framework through which we tend to view it now was not widely shared at the time. The idea that childhood should be a stage of life separate from productive work, spent primarily in learning and play, was a middle-class and upper-class conception. For most of English history, children had worked as soon as they were able, and the question was not whether they would work, but what kind of work they would do and under what conditions. The Industrial Revolution did not invent child labor. It industrialized it, concentrating it, removing it from the home and the field, and placing it inside large mechanized systems where the conditions were far harder to moderate and far easier to exploit. In the textile mills of Lancashire and Yorkshire, the main roles assigned to young children were piecing and scavenging. A piecer was a child who monitored a section of spinning frames and rejoined broken threads as they occurred. The frames ran continuously, and a break in a thread had to be caught quickly before it caused further problems. A piecer walked back and forth along the frame for most of the shift, watching the threads and reacting when something broke. The work required attention and quick hands, but not great physical strength, which made it suited to younger workers. Scavenging was a different kind of task. A scavenger crawled under the running machines to retrieve waste cotton or wool that had fallen during the spinning process. The machines did not stop during this operation. The child moved beneath the moving parts, collecting the loose material, and came back out when the job was done. The danger in this work was obvious. Children were injured when machines caught their hair or their clothing. Fingers were lost. There were deaths. The exact numbers are difficult to establish because record keeping was inconsistent and many injuries went unreported. But the parliamentary inquiries of the 1830s and 1840s gathered enough testimony from former mill workers to make the nature of the risks clear. The working day in a textile mill during the early Victorian period typically ran from around 5 or 6 in the morning to 7 or 8 at night. There were breaks for meals, usually around half an hour for breakfast and an hour at midday. But the total hours of labor in a day frequently exceeded 12. Children worked these hours alongside adults. The mills were warm from the machinery and often damp, partly because moisture in the air helped prevent the threads from breaking too easily. The noise was continuous. Communication between workers happened through lip reading and gesture as much as through speech. Workers who had spent years in the mills developed characteristic postures and ailments. Weavers often developed curvature of the spine from standing in bent positions at their looms for long hours over many years. Spinners breathed in cotton dust which accumulated in their lungs over time. Children who started work young and continued through their adolescence into adulthood carried these effects for the rest of their lives. The dust-related lung conditions were not yet well understood in medical terms, but mill workers themselves recognized the pattern. An older spinner in a Lancashire mill might have a characteristic cough that everyone in the community understood as a mark of the work. The towns that grew up around the mills had their own particular character. They were not planned in any deliberate sense. They grew in response to the demand for housing from the workers who came to fill the mills, and they grew quickly and without much regulation. Rows of terraced houses were built close together near the factory buildings. The streets were often unpaved. There was little or no sanitation infrastructure in the early decades of the 19th century. Water came from shared pumps or wells that were frequently contaminated. Waste accumulated in yards and alleys. The density of people in these streets meant that disease moved quickly through the population. Cholera outbreaks moved through the industrial towns of northern England in waves during the first half of the 19th century. The epidemic of 1831 and 1832 killed tens of thousands of people across the country, with the industrial towns of the north among the hardest hit. Children were particularly vulnerable because they were often already weakened by long working hours and inadequate nutrition. The connection between the physical conditions of the working class districts and the mortality rates was visible to anyone who looked, but the mechanisms were not yet understood scientifically, and the response was often limited to quarantine measures rather than improvements to sanitation. The housing in which mill-working families lived was typically 2 rooms on 2 floors, sometimes less. A family of 6 or 8 people might share a single sleeping room. The furniture was minimal. There was usually a fireplace for cooking and heating, and the household routine revolved around the fire in the evenings when work was finished. Children who worked in the mills came home tired and often sat near the fire before sleeping. The domestic evenings of working-class households in industrial towns were generally quiet by necessity. People were exhausted, supper was eaten, shoes were removed, and sleep came early because the morning would begin before light again. Within this domestic rhythm, there was still a household life. Older children helped younger ones. Women who were not working shifts managed the cooking and the washing and the errands. Neighbors shared information and small resources. The street was a communal space where children who were not yet old enough to work played in the hours between errands and meals. The density of the terraced streets meant that everyone knew everyone else's circumstances with a fairly high degree of accuracy. Whether a family was having a difficult week or had recently managed to put something aside, was not a secret that could be kept easily in streets where walls were thin and doors were open most of the day. It was within this broader social and economic landscape that the first reform efforts began to take shape. The movement to regulate the conditions of child labor in factories did not emerge suddenly or in response to a single event. It built slowly through the accumulation of testimony, through the work of individuals who toured the mills and spoke to the workers, and through a gradual shift in public awareness about what the conditions inside these workplaces actually were. Robert Owen was among the earliest and most prominent voices arguing for a different approach. Owen had made his fortune as a cotton mill owner at New Lanark in Scotland, a site he had acquired in 1799. At New Lanark, Owen ran his mills under conditions that were notably different from what prevailed elsewhere. He refused to employ children under 10 years old. He provided schooling for the children of his workers. He invested in the physical environment of the village that housed his workers, improving the housing and maintaining communal spaces. And he ran the mills profitably, which allowed him to argue that humane working conditions and commercial success were not incompatible. Owen's model attracted visitors from across Britain and from abroad. Politicians, reformers, and curious observers came to New Lanark to see what he had created. But Owen's specific practices did not spread rapidly or widely into the broader textile industry. The economic pressures facing smaller or less secure mill owners were different from Owen's position, and the culture of the industry did not naturally incline toward his way of thinking. His contribution was more in the realm of demonstrating possibility than in immediately changing general practice. The legislative effort to reform child labor in factories found its first significant expression in the Factory Act of 1833. This was not the first legislation to address the subject. There had been an earlier act in 1802, the Health and Morals of Apprentices Act, which set limits on the working hours of pauper apprentices in cotton mills. But that act had been largely ineffective because there was no mechanism to enforce it. Mill owners were expected to comply voluntarily, and most did not. The 1819 Factory Act had prohibited the employment of children under 9 in cotton mills and set a maximum working day of 12 hours for children between 9 and 16. Again, enforcement was almost non-existent. The 1833 Act was different in one significant respect. It created the Factory Inspectorate, a body of paid officials whose job was to visit factories and check whether the law was being followed. The Act prohibited the employment of children under 9 in textile mills. It limited children between 9 and 13 to 9 hours of work per day and 48 hours per week. It required that children in this age group receive 2 hours of schooling per day, and it gave the inspectors the authority to enter premises and examine records. The 4 factory inspectors appointed under the 1833 Act had an enormous geographic territory to cover. Each inspector was responsible for a large region of the country and employed sub-inspectors to assist with the actual visits. Given the number of textile mills in operation across Lancashire, Yorkshire, Cheshire, and other manufacturing counties, regular inspection of every workplace was impossible. Inspectors visited what they could and responded to complaints when they received them. The degree to which the act was actually followed varied considerably from one mill to the next. Some employers adjusted their practices immediately, others made changes when they knew an inspection was likely, and returned to previous habits when inspectors were absent. The school requirement in the 1833 Act created practical problems that illustrated how thin the infrastructure supporting these reforms actually was. There were very few schools in working-class industrial districts capable of receiving mill children for 2 hours each day. Many mill owners built schoolrooms on their premises to satisfy the requirement, but the quality of instruction in these rooms was often minimal. The teacher was sometimes an older mill worker who could read and write at a basic level. The curriculum was elementary and the time was limited. Children who attended learned the rudiments of reading and some arithmetic, But the schooling provided under the Factory Act was not equivalent to the education available in the schools that served middle-class children. This disparity in educational provision was one of the ways in which the gap between working-class and middle-class childhoods expressed itself concretely. A child from a professional family in Manchester or Birmingham in 1840 would attend a school for several years, learning to read and write fluently, studying history and geography and basic mathematics, and spending most of the day in a structured educational environment. A child of the same age who worked in a mill would receive perhaps 2 hours of instruction each day in a room attached to the factory, delivered by a teacher who might themselves have received very little education. The divergence in life outcomes that began from these starting points was significant and lasting. Coal mining was the other major industry where child labor was extensive and the conditions were severe. The coal fields of County Durham, Northumberland, South Wales, Yorkshire, and the Midlands employed large numbers of children throughout the early and mid-Victorian period. The work children performed in mines was different from mill work and in many ways more dangerous. The coal mines of the early 19th century were accessed through shafts sunk into the earth, sometimes reaching hundreds of feet down. Workers descended by a variety of means, including rope ladders and later mechanical cages. The tunnels at the base of the shafts were narrow, often only a few feet high, carved just wide enough for the coal to be extracted and transported. These conditions made children useful in specific roles that adults found physically difficult or impossible. Trappers were among the youngest workers in the mines. A trapper's job was to sit beside a ventilation door in the underground tunnels and open and close it as workers and coal tubs passed through. The doors were necessary for regulating the airflow through the mine, which kept the atmosphere breathable and diluted the explosive gases that naturally accumulated in coal workings. Without the trappers, the doors would remain open or closed in ways that disrupted ventilation. With them, the system worked as intended. A trapper might be as young as 5 or 6 years old. The work itself was not physically strenuous, but it meant sitting alone in a narrow, dark tunnel for the entire shift, sometimes 10 or 12 hours, in near total darkness. The child would have a small candle or lamp, but fuel was rationed and the light might be extinguished for long periods. The sounds in the mine were the sounds of distant work, the movement of tubs, the creak of timber supports, and sometimes the distant rumble that preceded a roof fall. The trappers sat with these sounds and waited for the next worker or tub to pass through so they could operate their door. Hurriers and putters were older children, usually between 8 and 14, who hauled coal from the working face to the base of the shaft. In some mines, this was done by pushing or pulling wheeled tubs along iron rails. In others, where the passages were too narrow for tubs, children dragged baskets or sledges loaded with coal while moving on hands and knees. The baskets were attached to a belt around the child's waist, and a chain ran between the legs to a hook on the load. The child bent forward and crawled along the tunnel, pulling the weight behind them. The physical demands of this work were considerable. The passages were low, the loads were heavy, and the conditions were wet in many mines, with water dripping from the roof or running along the floor. Children who worked as hurriers for years developed muscular bodies from the effort, but also developed characteristic injuries. Spine curvature was common. Knee and hip problems developed from working in cramped positions over long periods. The darkness and the dampness combined with the physical strain made the work exhausting in a way that was different from the exhaustion of mill work, which was standing and attending rather than physical effort, though both were tiring in their own ways. The Mines Act of 1842 was in many ways the most significant single piece of legislation affecting child labor in the early Victorian period. It came in the wake of a commission of inquiry led by Lord Ashley, later the Earl of Shaftesbury, whose investigators had descended into the coal mines and gathered testimony from the workers, including the children. The report that resulted from this inquiry was published with illustrations showing the conditions in the mines, including images of children dragging coal tubs through narrow passages. The effect of the report on public opinion was considerable. The 1842 Act prohibited the employment underground of all girls and women and of boys under 10 years old. Inspectors were appointed to monitor compliance. The act was immediately significant for the women and girls who had worked underground in the Yorkshire and Scottish coalfields, where female labor underground had been more common than in other regions. For children, the act established 10 as the minimum age for underground work, though children between 10 and 18 could still work underground under certain conditions. The reaction to the 1842 Act among mine owners varied. In some coalfields, the act was received with compliance, if not enthusiasm. In others, there was resistance. And in the early years after the act came into force, the inspectors found continuing violations. Boys younger than 10 were sometimes found underground during inspections, their ages recorded incorrectly or their presence explained away. The inspectors took what action they could, but the number of mines was large and the inspectorate was small. Outside the textile mills and coal mines, child labor in Victorian England took many forms. Chimney sweeping was perhaps the most widely known, partly because of its visibility, and partly because the physical demands on the climbing boys were so extreme and the results so apparent. Master sweeps employed boys who were small enough to climb inside the flues of domestic and commercial chimneys and sweep them clean from the inside. A climbing boy, as they were known, worked with a brush and scraper. He pressed his back against one wall of the flue and his feet and knees against the other, and moved upward by alternating these pressure points, pushing himself higher through sheer muscular effort. The flues were narrow, sometimes only 9 inches across at their tightest points. Boys who were too large to fit would not be hired. Boys were deliberately kept small by their masters, sometimes through restricted feeding, to prolong their usefulness in the narrower flues. The work was covered in soot. Boys who swept chimneys developed characteristic skin conditions from the repeated contact with soot, and chimney sweeps cancer, a scrotal cancer caused by long-term exposure to soot carcinogens, was identified in the 18th century by the surgeon Percival Pott, making it one of the earliest recognized occupational cancers in medical history. Boys who were injured in the flues by becoming stuck or by falling sometimes died before help could reach them. There were fires in chimneys while boys were inside them. The reform of chimney sweeping took longer than the reform of mills and mines, because chimney sweeping was distributed across thousands of small master sweeps rather than concentrated in a small number of large industrial establishments. It was harder to inspect and harder to regulate. Legislation prohibiting the use of climbing boys was passed several times and repeatedly failed to take effect. It was not until the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 that comprehensive regulation with effective enforcement was finally achieved, requiring all sweeps to be licensed and inspectable by police. Agriculture employed more children than any other sector in Victorian England, though agricultural child labor attracted less attention from reformers and legislators than factory or mine work, partly because of assumptions about the relative wholesomeness of outdoor country work compared with factory conditions. The reality of agricultural child labor was not particularly benign. Children in rural areas worked in the fields from a young age, assisting with planting, weeding, harvesting, and animal care. The hours were long during planting and harvest seasons. The work was physically demanding, and the pay was minimal. The gang system was a particularly intensive form of agricultural child labor that developed in the eastern counties of England during the mid-19th century. In areas where large-scale arable farming was expanding, particularly in Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire, and Norfolk, labor contractors organized gangs of workers, including women and children, who moved from farm to farm doing piecework. The gang master contracted with farmers to complete specific tasks, and the workers within the gang were paid by the amount of work completed rather than by the hour. Gang work often involved long walks between farms, with the workers traveling several miles on foot to reach the field where they would work that day and then walking back again in the evening. Children in the gangs were sometimes as young as 5 or 6, following along with older workers and contributing what labor they could. The gang master had considerable authority over the workers during the working day, and abuses of that authority were reported periodically. The Agricultural Gangs Act of 1867 prohibited the employment of children under 8 in gangs and required gang masters to be licensed. But agricultural child labor in general remained largely outside the regulatory framework that was being built up around factory work. The brickmaking industry employed children extensively throughout the Victorian period. The manufacture of brick was a labor-intensive process that expanded rapidly as the demand for building materials grew with urbanization. Clay had to be dug, mixed, and molded into bricks by hand. The bricks had to be dried and then fired in kilns, and the whole process involved a great deal of carrying and stacking that children could perform. Brick yards were generally seasonal operations, running through the spring and summer when the weather allowed outdoor work and the drying process could proceed. During the working season, the days were long and the work was continuous. Children who worked in brick yards carried clay and unformed bricks from the mixing area to the molding tables, moved formed bricks from the molds to the drying grounds, and stacked dried bricks ready for the kiln. The clay was heavy, and the repetition was relentless. Brickyard children were often described by observers as among the most physically degraded of the working-class children, bent under loads and coated in clay dust. The open-air environment meant they were exposed to weather in all seasons, and the kilns that fired the bricks made the yards hot and smoky during production periods. Pottery manufacture in Staffordshire employed children in a different way. The potteries, centered on the towns of Stoke-on-Trent and its surrounding area, were home to dozens of pottery manufacturers, making everything from domestic earthenware to fine china. Children in the potteries worked primarily as mold runners and jigger turners, carrying molds of wet clay from one part of the workshop to another, or turning the wheel that shaped vessels on a potter's jig. The work was not enormously physically demanding, but the environment in the pottery workshops was unhealthy. Lead was used in the glazing of many earthenware products, and workers who handled the lead-based glaze over long periods accumulated lead in their bodies. Children working in pottery workshops were exposed to lead dust and lead compounds from a young age, and the effects on their development were significant even when not immediately obvious. The lace-making industry of the East Midlands, centered in Nottingham and the surrounding villages, employed children from a very young age in a different kind of work. Handmade lace was a cottage industry, and children learned to use the pillow and bobbins of lace making as part of household production. Lace schools existed in many villages where children gathered under the supervision of an older woman to work together at their lace cushions. The term school was misleading. The children came to learn lace making, not to receive the kind of education that the word implied. They sat for hours at a time, bent over their work, in rooms that were often cramped and poorly lit. The physical effects of long hours of close work on young children's eyes and posture were noted by observers and by the children themselves. Short-sightedness was common among lace workers who had started as children, and the bent posture required for the work contributed to the same kinds of spinal development problems seen in other sedentary but physically demanding occupations. Straw plaiting, which was the primary occupation of children in parts of Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire, and Bedfordshire, had a similar character. Children as young as 3 or 4 were set to work plaiting straws into strips that would later be sewn into hats and bonnets. The work could be done anywhere and needed no equipment, so children plaited while walking to and from errands, while sitting in doorways, while waiting for other household tasks. The platting schools that existed in these counties were analogous to the lace schools, places where children gathered to work together rather than to receive instruction in reading or other subjects. In the cities, child labor took forms that were less industrial but no less pervasive. London in the mid-19th century was full of children who earned money through a variety of street occupations. Crossing sweepers cleared the mud and horse droppings from street crossings and waited for passers-by to reward them with a penny. Watercress sellers bought small bunches of watercress from the market before dawn and walked the streets selling them for a small markup. Match sellers stood at street corners with their trays. Newspaper sellers called out the headlines and ran to customers who signaled them. Henry Mayhew, who published his extensive survey of London labor and the London poor in the early 1850s, documented many of these child street workers in considerable detail. His accounts of individual children who earned their livings on the streets of London are among the most detailed contemporary records of urban child labor in Victorian England. Mayhew spoke to children directly, recorded their accounts of how they lived and how they spent their days, and described the physical environments in which they worked with a precision that was unusual for the period. A girl who sold watercress, whom Mayhew interviewed when she was around 8 years old, described rising at 3:30 in the morning to walk to the market, arriving before 5 to buy her stock, and then walking through the streets until she had sold everything she carried, which might take until midday. She then went home, and if her earnings were sufficient, the day was done. If they were not, she might go back out in the afternoon. Her account of the cold in winter, when she had to carry the wet cress with bare hands, and the way the cold made her hands ache, was delivered without complaint. She appeared to treat this as simply a description of her occupation. The street children of London occupied a complex position in the social geography of the city. They were visible in ways that mill children were not, because they worked in public spaces rather than inside factory buildings. Passers-by encountered them constantly. Reform-minded middle-class Londoners worried about them, sometimes with genuine concern, and sometimes with concerns more about social order and the potential for crime than about the children's own well-being. The ragged school movement, which began in the 1840s, was one response to this visibility. Ragged schools offered free basic education to children too poor to attend ordinary schools, and they spread rapidly through London and other cities during the 1840s and 1850s. The ragged schools were run primarily by volunteers, often evangelical Christians, who combined educational provision with religious instruction. The curriculum was basic: reading, writing, arithmetic, and scripture. The schools operated in the evenings and on Sundays to accommodate children who worked during the day. A child who sold newspapers in the morning and watercress in the afternoon might attend a ragged school on Sunday evening. The education was limited, but it was more than nothing, and for some children, it opened paths that would otherwise have been entirely closed. The condition of children employed as domestic servants in middle-class and upper-class households was different in character from those in factories and mines, though not necessarily easier in all respects. Domestic service was the largest single category of female employment in Victorian England, and it included a significant number of girls in their early teens and younger. A girl entering service might start as a scullery maid at 12 or 13, doing the heaviest and dirtiest kitchen work, washing up after meals and scrubbing floors, for wages that were minimal but included room and board. The experience of domestic service varied enormously depending on the household. In a well-run household with an established domestic staff, a young servant had a degree of structure and safety that street work did not provide. She slept in a room, ate regular meals, and worked under the supervision of a housekeeper or cook who might take some interest in her development. In a poorly run household, or one in which the employers were indifferent or unkind, the situation was different. Young servants in small households where they were the only servant, often called maids of all work, worked essentially all day with no colleagues and little protection from the demands of an employer. The question of what constituted appropriate treatment for a child servant was not clearly defined, and the law offered little protection. A servant was employed by contract, and the relationship between employer and servant was a private one that domestic reformers found difficult to reach. Reports of young servants being required to work until late at night and rise before dawn, of being refused adequate food or clothing, or of being dismissed without wages for minor infractions appeared regularly in the correspondence of reform organizations and occasionally in court cases. But the privacy of the domestic sphere meant that these situations were usually not visible until something went conspicuously wrong. By the middle decades of the 19th century, the reform movement addressing child labor had accumulated considerable momentum, and the legislative framework was being extended in a series of incremental steps. The Factory Acts of 1844, 1847, and 1850 progressively tightened the regulations on hours and working conditions in textile mills, and the scope of factory legislation was being extended to industries beyond textiles. The 10 Hours Act of 1847, which limited the working day of women and young persons in textile mills to 10 hours, was a significant milestone, though it applied initially only to the specified categories of workers and required additional legislation to close loopholes that some employers exploited. The push to extend the Factory Acts to non-textile industries was slower and more contested. Each industry argued its own case for exemption, and the legislative process was complicated by the combination of genuine economic concerns, ideological opposition to state regulation, and the lobbying of employer interests. The Workshops Act of 1867 extended some Factory Act provisions to smaller workshops, and the Factory and Workshops Act of 1878 consolidated much of the earlier legislation and extended it more comprehensively across different sectors of industry. The education question was increasingly intertwined with the child labor debate as the century progressed. The argument that children who were working could not be learning, and that a literate and educated workforce served both the interests of the individual and the interests of the country, became more prominent in reform debates from the 1860s onward. The Education Act of 1870, which established a framework for elementary education across England and Wales by creating school boards in areas where voluntary provision was insufficient, was a turning point. For the first time, there was a legislative commitment to providing schooling for all children regardless of class. The 1870 Act did not immediately transform educational participation. It created the infrastructure for schools, but did not make attendance compulsory. Many families continued to keep children at home or send them to work rather than school, whether from economic necessity or from a different set of priorities. The drive for compulsory attendance followed in subsequent legislation. The Education Act of 1880 made attendance at elementary school compulsory for children between 5 and 10. The Elementary Education Act of 1891 made elementary education free, removing the fee that had previously been an obstacle for poorer families. The combination of compulsory schooling and regulatory limits on child labor began to work together in a reinforcing way. As the lower age limit for certain kinds of work rose and the hours available for work were reduced, the time that children spent in school increased by default. As more children spent more years in school, the idea of childhood as a period associated with education rather than labor began to penetrate more deeply into working class as well as middle class culture. This shift was not instant, and it was not complete within the Victorian era. Factory inspection records from the 1880s and 1890s continued to document violations of the child labor regulations. Children continued to be employed in agricultural work, in domestic service, and in the street trades in numbers that were not directly regulated by the Factory Acts. The boundary between full-time work and the kind of part-time or domestic work that was invisible to inspectors remained contested and porous. The economic conditions of working-class households did not change quickly enough to make child labor economically unnecessary for all families by the end of the century. The wages paid to adult male workers in many industries had improved since the early decades of the century, partly through the growth of trade unions and partly through the general rise in real wages that the late Victorian economy produced. But the margin between adequate income and poverty was still narrow for many households, and the temptation to put children to work when possible did not disappear simply because legislation said they should be in school. School board visitors, whose job was to identify children who were not attending school as required and to report their families to the relevant authorities, operated in a landscape of competing pressures. A family that could not afford to feed everyone well enough if the children stopped working was not going to be persuaded by a fine or a warning. The school board visitor might return several times and find the same children absent, the same explanations given, the same promises made and not kept. The system was trying to change behavior that was rooted in economic necessity, and until the economic necessity changed, the behavior would not change entirely. In the north of England, the half-time system was a formal compromise that had emerged from the textile industry reforms. Under this arrangement, children between 10 and 13 could work half the day in the mill and attend school for the other half. The system had been established partly as a practical accommodation between the demands of the mills and the requirements of the education legislation, and it persisted well into the later decades of the century. Children on the half-time system often worked the first half of the day in the mill and attended afternoon school, or alternated days of work and school in other combinations. The arrangement satisfied neither the mill owners, who would have preferred full-time child workers, nor the educational reformers who wanted full-time school attendance. But it represented a workable middle position that both could live with. The lives of half-time children had a particular rhythm. They rose early on mill mornings, worked their half shift, and went to school still tired from the morning's work. On school-only days, they attended morning and afternoon sessions and might have household duties in the evenings. The transition from full-time child worker to full-time school pupil was not something that happened in a single step for most working-class children in the textile districts. It was more of a gradual reconfiguration of daily time as the regulatory requirements shifted over the years. Teachers in the schools that received half-time children were often aware of how tired their pupils were. Children who had already worked several hours before arriving at school in the afternoon were not in the best state for learning. Some teachers adjusted their expectations accordingly, focusing on reinforcement of basic skills rather than attempting to introduce new material in afternoon sessions. Others were frustrated by the difficulty of teaching children who were struggling to stay awake. The physical condition of the children also made an impression on teachers. Children from the mills often had a characteristic pale, thin appearance that reflected inadequate nutrition and too many hours indoors in poor air. Nutrition among working-class children in Victorian England deserves some attention because it shaped everything else about their capacity to work and to learn. The diet of a mill-working family in the 1850s or 1860s typically centered on bread, potatoes, and porridge, supplemented occasionally by small amounts of meat or fish, cheese, and vegetables when available and affordable. Tea was consumed widely, often heavily sweetened with cheap sugar, because it provided warmth and a feeling of fullness at minimal cost. The caloric content of this diet was generally sufficient for survival, but often deficient in the nutrients needed for healthy growth and development. Children who were growing quickly and working physically demanding hours required more than survival calories. The particular nutritional deficiencies common in working-class diets of the period, including insufficient protein, calcium, and certain vitamins, contributed to the physical characteristics observed by reformers and medical observers. Small stature, late physical maturation, susceptibility to respiratory illness, and poor dental health. The systematic investigation of childhood nutrition and its relationship to development was not a feature of Victorian science. But the broad patterns were visible to observers who spent any time in working-class communities. Moving from the industrial north to consider conditions in the Midlands and South gives a sense of how varied the experience of child labor was across different regions and industries. The Black Country, the industrial region west of Birmingham centered on the manufacture of metal goods, had its own patterns of child employment. The nail-making industry in South Staffordshire was partly organized on a domestic basis, with families working small forges attached to their homes. Children in nail-making families learned the forge early, helping with the bellows and the simpler tasks of the process. The work was hot and the hours were long, but the domestic organization meant that children worked alongside family members, rather than under the supervision of an employer. Chain making, another Black Country industry, had similar characteristics. Chain making was performed in small workshops and outbuildings, often by women and children who worked alongside male skilled workers. The work involved heating metal links in a forge and hammering them together, requiring considerable strength for the heavier chains, but manageable for children on the lighter gauges. The workshops were hot from the forges and filled with the sound of hammering, but they were small and family connected in ways that large mills were not. Lock making in Willenhall and Wolverhampton was organized differently. The lock industry produced a variety of locks and keys for the domestic and commercial market, and the work was highly skilled. Master lockmakers employed apprentices who worked alongside them, learning the trade through years of practice. Children who entered the lock trade as young teenagers might serve apprenticeships lasting 7 years, during which they lived with the master's household and received training in exchange for their labor. The conditions of lock-making apprenticeships varied considerably, and not all masters were attentive to the development of their apprentices, but the system had a different character from factory employment. Staffordshire and the surrounding areas also had significant employment of children in the manufacture of chains and hooks for the anchor and chain industries serving the maritime sector. Anchor chains for large vessels required heavy ironwork that was performed by adult skilled smiths, but the assembly and finishing work on smaller chains involved younger workers. The geography of industrial Britain meant that different towns and districts were associated with specific products, and the child labor patterns within each industry were shaped by the specific nature of the work involved. Moving toward the end of the century, the changes that had been accumulating in the regulatory framework, in educational provision, and gradually in economic conditions began to produce measurable differences in the experience of childhood in working-class communities. The children who entered the workforce in the 1890s were doing so under different conditions from those of 1840. The minimum ages were higher, the hours were shorter, school attendance, though not universal, was much more common. The worst abuses of the early industrial period, the pauper apprentices, the climbing boys, the trappers sitting alone in the dark, had been addressed or were in the process of being addressed. The change was real, but incomplete. The late Victorian working-class childhood was still considerably more labor-intensive than a middle-class childhood of the same period. Children were still expected to contribute to household economics in ways that were not asked of children in comfortable circumstances. The idea of childhood as a stage requiring protection and devoted to development was still significantly class-inflected, but the trajectory was visible and the direction was unmistakable. Part of what drove the change was the expanding body of evidence about the relationship between child labor, health, and social outcomes. Medical officers of health, whose appointment in the major cities became standard from the late 1840s onward, compiled statistics on mortality, morbidity, and physical condition that told a clear story about the effects of poverty and overwork on children's bodies. The campaigns around public health, which focused initially on water supply and sanitation, gradually expanded to include nutrition and housing and working conditions as connected aspects of the health environment. The growing field of social investigation, represented by figures like Mayhew in the 1850s and later by Charles Booth in the 1880s and 1890s, produced increasingly systematic knowledge about the conditions of working-class life. Booth's monumental survey of London life and labor, published in volumes from 1889 onward, mapped the poverty of London with unprecedented precision and brought before educated readers a detailed picture of how large a proportion of the city's population lived in conditions of chronic deprivation. The survey counted children among those affected by poverty and documented the ways in which poverty perpetuated itself through inadequate nutrition, limited education, and the necessity of early labor. The trade union movement, which was consolidating its strength during the later Victorian decades, also contributed indirectly to the improvement of conditions for working-class children. As adult male workers organized and secured higher wages and shorter hours, the economic pressure to supplement family income with children's earnings was somewhat reduced. The 8-hour day campaigns of the 1880s and 1890s were primarily focused on adult workers, but their success contributed to a gradual normalization of the idea that working people's time had limits, and that those limits should be enforced by law. By the 1890s, the Factory and Workshops Act of 1878 had been supplemented and strengthened in a series of subsequent amendments. The inspectorate had grown and its methods had become more systematic. The employment of children under 10 in any factory or workshop was effectively prohibited. Children between 10 and 13 were subject to the half-time provisions. Young persons between 13 and 18 were subject to specific hours limitations. The legislation had become considerably more comprehensive than the patchwork of earlier acts, though it still did not cover domestic service, agriculture, or the street trades. The figures of the early reform movement, men like Richard Ostler, who coined the phrase Yorkshire slavery to describe the condition of factory children in the early 1830s, and Lord Ashley, who pushed the Mines and Collieries Acts through Parliament, had worked against considerable resistance from the mill and mine owners, who saw regulation as an attack on their economic interests. The arguments made in favor of continuing child labor ranged from the economic necessity of cheap labor for industry to the social benefit of keeping working-class children occupied rather than idle. Some argued that children were better off in mills than in the conditions of working-class streets. Some argued that regulation would harm the competitive position of British industry relative to countries with fewer restrictions. These arguments were gradually overcome not by a single overwhelming moral argument, but by the accumulation of evidence, the persistence of reformers over decades, and the gradual shift in the economic and social environment that made the old arrangements less necessary and the new ones more feasible. The shift was incremental and uneven. There was no single moment at which Victorian child labor ended. The process of restriction and regulation extended across the entire second half of the 19th century and into the early 20th. The children who lived through the early Victorian decades, who had worked as piecers or trappers or climbing boys or scavengers, grew into adults who had experienced the industrial system from the inside. Some of them became workers who organized with their colleagues for better conditions. Some of them became parents who tried to delay the entry of their own children into the workforce when they could. Some of them became local officials or school board members or trade union representatives who worked within the emerging institutional framework to improve conditions in their own communities. The reform movement itself, which had been largely driven by middle-class philanthropists and parliamentary reformers in its early decades, gradually incorporated working-class voices as trade unions grew and as working-class political participation increased through successive extensions of the franchise. The perspective of a parent who had worked in a mill since childhood and wanted different conditions for their own children was different from the perspective of a reforming aristocrat visiting a mill for the first time, but both contributed to the pressure that eventually produced legislative change. Wales had its own pattern of child labor that was shaped by the particular character of its major industries. The slate quarries of North Wales employed children and young persons in work that was different from the coal mines of South Wales, but no less physically demanding. The slate quarrying districts of Gwynedd, centered on towns like Bethesda and Blaenau-Festiniog, were organized around the extraction and splitting of slate for the roofing and building materials market. The work of splitting slate into roofing tiles was a skilled process, and children learned it from an early age, working alongside experienced adult splitters. South Wales had its own extensive coal industry, and the valleys of the Rhondda and the Cynon and the Merthyr districts were being rapidly developed during the mid-Victorian period to supply the growing demand for steam coal. The organization of the South Wales coalfield had some differences from the northern English fields. The Welsh miners had a strong tradition of community organization and chapel attendance that gave working life a particular social texture. Children who worked in the mines were embedded in a chapel-going, choral-singing, closely knit community that provided a social framework even as the working conditions remained hard. In Scotland, the textile industries of the Central Belt, centered on Glasgow and the surrounding areas, and the linen industries of Dundee and the East Coast, employed children in patterns broadly similar to those in northern England. Dundee's jute industry, which expanded significantly in the second half of the 19th century to process jute fiber imported from Bengal, was notable for the high proportion of women and children among its workforce. The work of processing raw jute into cloth was dirty and physically demanding, producing dust that affected workers' lungs, and the low wages that characterized the Dundee jute industry meant that every member of a working family was expected to contribute. The Irish dimension of Victorian child labor is sometimes overlooked in accounts that focus primarily on England. Ireland, under British administration, had its own patterns of child work, shaped by a predominantly agricultural economy and by the catastrophic disruption of the Great Famine of the 1840s, which fundamentally altered the demographic and economic landscape of the country. Before the famine, children in Irish rural households contributed to agricultural and domestic work in ways broadly similar to pre-industrial patterns in England after the famine. The massive emigration that accompanied and followed it carried hundreds of thousands of Irish people to England, Scotland, Wales, and North America. Irish immigrant families who settled in the industrial cities of Britain often occupied the lowest rungs of the economic ladder, taking the least skilled and lowest paid work and living in the worst housing. Their children entered the labor market at the same age and in the same jobs as the children of other working-class families in those cities. In Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, and London, Irish-born children and children of Irish parents worked in the mills and mines and streets, alongside children whose families had been in the industrial north for generations. The question of schooling was affected by the religious composition of the Irish immigrant community. Catholic families often preferred Catholic schools, and the provision of Catholic elementary education in England was built up through the voluntary system, with churches founding and running schools that served Catholic working-class communities. The Catholic school network was a significant provider of elementary education in cities with large Irish populations by the second half of the 19th century, and it meant that some Irish children who might not have attended schools connected to the Church of England or to the school board system had access to educational provision through the Catholic voluntary network. Returning to consider the physical environment in which reform was happening, it is worth paying attention to the changing built landscape of the industrial towns through the Victorian period. The rapid and largely unplanned growth of the early industrial era had produced towns of extraordinary density and poor conditions. The public health movement of the mid-Victorian period, responding to the cholera epidemics and to the growing body of medical knowledge about the relationship between environment and disease, began to produce legal frameworks and administrative institutions for improving the urban environment. The Public Health Act of 1848 established local boards of health in towns where mortality rates were sufficiently high to trigger action. The improvement of water supply and sewerage was the central concern of these boards, as clean water became available through public pipes and standpipes, and as sewage was directed into proper drainage systems rather than cesspits and open streams. The mortality rates in industrial towns began to fall. The immediate beneficiaries were everyone in the population, but children benefited particularly because they had been among the most vulnerable to the waterborne diseases the clean water supply eliminated. Better housing was a slower improvement. The terraced houses of the mid-Victorian period were an improvement on the worst of the early industrial housing, which had sometimes been built with no ventilation, no light, and no sanitation at all. Model dwelling companies like the Peabody Trust, founded in 1862, built blocks of improved housing for the working poor in London, providing clean rooms, proper kitchens, and communal washing facilities. These model dwellings reached only a small proportion of those who needed better housing, but they demonstrated that habitable working-class housing could be built and operated sustainably. The Parks movement of the mid-Victorian period was also relevant to the lives of working-class children, though it is sometimes overlooked in accounts of social reform. The creation of public parks in industrial cities from the 1840s onward provided open space for recreation in environments that were otherwise entirely built over. Victoria Park in Manchester, Peel Park in Salford, People's Park in Halifax, and their equivalents in Birmingham, Leeds, and other towns gave working-class children access to grass and trees and open air in ways that the terraced streets did not provide. The parks were envisioned partly as places where working people could relax and recover from the week's labor, and children used them freely on Sundays and on summer evenings. The mechanics institutes that had been established in the 1820s and 1830s in industrial towns offered another kind of resource, though one directed primarily at adult workers. They provided libraries, lecture halls, and classes in subjects ranging from science and technology to history and literature. Working-class men who wanted to improve their knowledge and skills had a venue in the mechanics institutes that had not existed for their father's generation. Over time, the institutes also contributed to the cultural and intellectual life of the industrial towns in ways that had indirect effects on how education was valued within the working-class community. As the Victorian period moved toward its final decades, the combination of all these changes, regulatory, educational, economic, and environmental, was producing a working-class childhood that looked somewhat different from what it had been in 1840. The difference was most visible in the textile districts of the north, where the half-time system was gradually giving way to full-time schooling, and in the coal mining communities, where the minimum age for underground work had been raised and the inspectorate was more active. It was less visible in agriculture, in domestic service, and in the street trades of London and other cities, where the regulatory framework remained thinner. The children of the 1890s who attended elementary school for the full day, who played in public parks on Saturday afternoons, and whose parents worked 10-hour days in mills and workshops rather than 14, were living a childhood that would have been recognizable in broad outline to a middle-class observer in a way that the childhood of a mill-working 9-year-old in 1840 would not have been. The convergence was partial, and the inequality between classes in the quality and length of childhood remained very large. But the direction of change had been established and was continuing. The individuals who occupied the minor administrative roles of the Victorian reform system deserve a moment of attention. The factory inspector making his rounds through the mills of Yorkshire in 1855, arriving at a gate, requesting the overlooker's attendance book, checking the ages recorded against the physical appearance of the children present, asking to see the schooling certificates that were required for half-time workers, was performing a routine that was neither dramatic nor glamorous. He was doing paperwork in damp and noisy environments, negotiating with mill owners who were sometimes cooperative and sometimes obstructive, writing reports that would be filed in London and read by the commissioner of the time. This work of inspection and verification was the unglamorous machinery of reform, and it functioned imperfectly and slowly, but it functioned. The school board visitor making her calls in the courts and alleys of a Birmingham slum in 1875, knocking on doors and asking mothers why their children had not been at school that week, was performing a similarly unglamorous role. She was not celebrated in the newspapers. She was not a figure whose name appeared in parliamentary debates. She was part of an administrative network that was trying to translate legislative requirements into practical behavior in the households of the working poor. And she was navigating the complex social landscape of class, poverty, and domestic authority that those households represented. These figures of middle management in the reform system were numerous and largely anonymous, but they were the connection between legislation and practice. Without the inspectors and the visitors and the school board officers and the medical officers, the Acts of Parliament would have remained largely aspirational. The administrative infrastructure of reform was as important as the legislation itself, and it grew gradually over the decades as the Victorian state built up its capacity to reach into areas of social and economic life where it had previously not operated. The question of what children themselves understood and thought about their situation is difficult to answer with confidence from the historical record. The testimony gathered by parliamentary commissioners in the 1830s and 1840s contains the direct words of children who were interviewed in the mines and mills, and these accounts have a directness that is striking. A boy asked how long he had worked in a particular mine, what time he arrived in the morning, what time he came up at the end of the shift, what he ate during the working day, answered in plain terms. He described physical sensations, the cold, the weight of the loads, the difficulty of the spaces, without apparent self-pity. Whether this manner of answering reflected emotional detachment, the natural adaptation of human beings to their circumstances, the reluctance of a child to complain to a stranger in a formal setting, or some combination of all of these, is impossible to determine with certainty. What the testimony does suggest is that these children lived within their circumstances as a matter of course, as the normal condition of their lives, and that they understood their work as part of what their lives were, rather than as an exception to something else. The concept of a different childhood against which to measure their own was not a reference point readily available to them. This is perhaps the most significant aspect of the Victorian child labor system when considered from the inside. It was not experienced primarily as oppression by those within it, because they had no clear alternative against which to measure it. It was simply life. The reformers who agitated against the conditions in the mills and mines were bringing an external moral framework to a situation that those within it largely accepted as given. The acceptance was not resignation in a philosophical sense. It was the practical orientation of people who were managing difficult circumstances and had to focus on what was immediate and manageable rather than on what was absent and unavailable. Over time, as schooling became more common and as the world of reform and improvement became part of the cultural landscape of working-class life, through the chapels and the mechanics institutes and the trade unions and the newspapers, working-class people increasingly developed their own critical perspective on the conditions in which they lived and worked. The idea that things could be otherwise, that children deserved more than was being given to them, took root within the working-class community, as well as being promoted from outside it. This internal shift was in many ways more significant than the external pressure of legislation. because it was more durable and more adaptable to the varied conditions of different industries and localities. The history of child labor reform in Victorian England is often told through the passage of particular acts of Parliament and the efforts of particular prominent reformers. But it is equally a story of slow, quiet changes in ordinary life across thousands of households and communities. Changes in what parents expected for their children, changes in what teachers expected from their pupils, changes in what workers expected from their hours and their wages. These changes moved at different rates in different places and did not follow a single timetable or narrative arc. They were the aggregate of many individual decisions and adjustments, accumulating over decades into a different way of organizing childhood. The records that survive from this period are most detailed for the exceptional and the institutional. Parliamentary inquiries, court cases, newspaper reports, and official statistics document the workings of the system in its formal dimensions. The everyday experience of ordinary children who worked, went to school, played in streets and parks, helped with household tasks, and grew up in the industrial towns of Victorian England is less thoroughly documented. It has to be reconstructed from fragments, from the memoirs of working-class writers who look back on their own childhoods, from the records of institutions like schools and charitable organizations, from the photographs that became more common as the century progressed. The photographs that survive from the later Victorian period show working-class children in a variety of postures and settings, standing outside factory gates, sitting in schoolrooms, gathered on street corners, posed in the formal style of studio photography for family portraits that a slightly more prosperous household might commission. The children in these photographs look out at the camera with expressions that are difficult to interpret across the distance of a century and a half. Some look directly and without apparent self-consciousness. Others seem uncertain of how to comport themselves. The photographs do not tell us much about the interior life of their subjects, but they remind us that the working children of the Victorian period were real individuals with individual faces and histories, not abstractions from social statistics. In the final years of the 19th century and into the early years of the 20th, the legal framework governing child labor continued to be strengthened and extended. The Factory and Workshop Act of 1901 consolidated and updated the existing legislation. The Employment of Children Act of 1903 addressed the employment of children outside factories and workshops, including street trading and domestic work. The Education Act of 1902 reformed the structure of the educational system, creating local education authorities that took over from the school boards and providing a more coherent framework for secondary as well as elementary education. The gradual raising of the school leaving age was perhaps the single most significant regulatory change in terms of its direct effect on child labor. When children were required to remain in school until 12 and eventually until 14, the availability of full-time child labor for industry was directly and formally limited. The employer who wanted to hire a 10-year-old for factory work found the law clearly against them, in ways that had not been true in 1830. The family that needed a child's wage contribution had to find it through part-time work within the legal framework rather than through full-time factory employment. The shift in the age of school leaving also reflected a shift in the understanding of what childhood was for. The idea that children needed years of education before entering the labor market, that their intellectual and physical development required a period of directed learning rather than productive work, became the dominant view within the educational and administrative culture of late Victorian England. This did not mean it was universally shared or universally practiced, but it was the direction in which policy was moving and in which cultural expectations were shifting. however, unevenly. The specific physical spaces in which child labor had been concentrated, the textile mills, the coal mines, the brick yards, the pottery workshops, were also changing in the late Victorian period in ways that affected the demand for child workers. Mechanization of certain processes reduced the need for the small hands and flexible bodies that children had provided in earlier periods. The piecing of broken threads in spinning frames could be done more efficiently as machinery improved. The ventilation systems in mines were upgraded in many coal fields, reducing the need for human trappers to manage airflow doors. These changes in industrial technology altered the economic calculation that had made child labor so attractive to employers in the earlier decades. The story of Victorian child labor is therefore not only a story of moral reform imposed on industry from outside, though it is partly that. It is also a story of economic and technological change that gradually made the old forms of child labor less useful to the industries that had depended on them. The two processes, legislative reform and economic change, worked together and reinforced each other, though they moved at different speeds and operated through different mechanisms. Looking back at the early months of 1843, at the boy named Thomas standing in the Lancashire mill as the machines began to turn, there is a temptation to frame his story as the beginning of something or the end of something, to give it a shape that it did not have at the time. For Thomas, the mill was simply the place where he went in the morning and came home from in the evening. His day had its own rhythm, its particular sensations of noise and warmth and repetition, its brief intervals of rest, its walk home at the end. He fitted himself into the system as it was, because that was what was required, and the system went on around him as it had for decades and would continue to for years after. The changes that would eventually transform the conditions in which children like Thomas worked were already in motion in 1843, building through the legislative process and through the work of reformers and administrators, but they were building slowly. Thomas's own working life would span years, in which the changes were gradual. He might have seen the hours shorten somewhat. He might have seen younger siblings attend school for more years than he had. The shift was too slow to be visible in any single week or month, but became apparent over the course of a decade. The mills themselves continued running through these decades of gradual change, processing cotton and wool and producing the cloth that was sold across Britain and exported around the world. The machinery was updated and improved, the buildings were expanded, the towns that housed the mills and their workers grew and developed their own civic institutions. Schools were built, libraries opened, parks were laid out. The social landscape of the industrial town became denser and more varied as the century progressed, acquiring the texture of a community that had existed for several generations, rather than the raw newness of the early industrial settlements. The children who worked in those later mills in the 1870s and 1880s worked within a different system from Thomas in 1843. The hours were shorter, the minimum age was higher, there was some expectation of schooling. The inspectors came periodically, their visits anticipated by the overlookers who managed compliance with the legal requirements. The work was still physically demanding. The environment was still noisy and warm. The days were still long by later standards. But the frame around the work had changed, and the frame would continue to change after those children grew up and their own children entered an even more regulated world. In the quieter moments of a mill town evening in the 1880s, a family sitting around a table with bread and tea might not have been aware of how much the ordinary circumstances of their life represented the accumulated effect of decades of reform, legislation, inspection, and debate. The children sitting at the table, some of them with school books, some of them due at the mill in the morning for a half-time shift, were living a childhood that was different from what their grandparents had known, even if it was still far from what the children of comfortable families experienced. The difference was real, even if it was not yet as large as reformers hoped it would eventually become. The records of the late Victorian period, school logs and census returns and trade union minutes and local newspapers, trace the continuing slow adjustment of these circumstances. A school log from a Lancashire mill town in the 1880s might record that attendance was low on a particular Monday because several families in the area had kept their children at home to help with some domestic task, or that a group of the older children were starting their half-time mill work that week, and that their afternoon attendance would now be on an alternating schedule. These entries were made without comment, as ordinary occurrences in an ordinary institution. But they document the precise point where the old system and the new system met, the place where a child moved from being entirely a school pupil to being partly a worker within the formal boundaries that the law had established. In the coal mining communities of County Durham and Northumberland, the mining families of the late Victorian period lived in villages that had grown up around the pits and had developed their own distinct social character. The rows of stone or brick terraced houses, the chapels that anchored community life, the colliery company offices, and the engine houses visible above the roof lines, the smell of coal dust that was simply a part of the air in these places, all of this formed the sensory and social environment in which children grew up. Boys in these communities grew up knowing that most of the men they knew worked underground, and many of them moved toward that work themselves as they entered their teenage years. The 1872 Coal Mines Regulation Act had raised the minimum age for underground work to 10, and later amendments raised it further. By the 1890s, boys entering the colliery were typically in their early to mid-teens, rather than the 8 or 9 of the pre-regulatory era. They started on surface work, sorting coal at the screens before moving underground. The screens were long conveyor belts or tables where coal fresh from the pit was sorted by hand, large pieces separated from the smaller grades and the stone and shale removed. Boys working at the screens worked outside in all weathers, bent over the moving coal, picking by hand for hours. The work was dirty and cold in winter, and the coal dust covered everything, but it was above ground, and the regulatory minimum age for screen work was lower than for underground work. The move from screen work to underground was a significant transition in the life of a mining family's son. It marked a kind of acceptance into the full world of the colliery and the community of miners. Underground work was physically harder and more dangerous, but it was also better paid than surface work, and the identity of a miner was tied to the underground world in a way that surface work did not fully confer. The transition was managed through a set of informal practices and rituals that varied by locality, but generally involved the experienced miners taking an interest in the newcomers' development, teaching the conventions and the techniques of the work that were not covered by any formal training. The mining communities of the later Victorian period were notable for their strong internal solidarity, expressed through the miners' unions that had developed in many coalfields from the 1860s onward. The unions negotiated with the colliery companies over wages and conditions, organized mutual aid for members who were injured or ill, and provided a form of social organization that paralleled and interacted with the chapel networks. The children who grew up in these communities absorbed the union culture as part of their social formation. They understood that wages were negotiated collectively, that solidarity mattered, and that the interests of the individual miner were bound up with the interests of the wider workforce. This culture of collective organization had effects on how the question of child labor was understood within the mining communities. The miners' unions generally supported the raising of the minimum age for underground work, both for the benefit of children and because younger workers at lower wages could undercut the position of adult miners in the labor market. The union position on child labor was not purely altruistic, but it aligned with the reform agenda in its practical effects, adding an organized working-class voice to the pressure for tighter regulation. The combination of union pressure from below and reformist legislation from above together with the gradual improvement in adult wages that made child labor economically somewhat less necessary for mining families, produced a situation by the 1890s in which the young teenage boy, starting work at the colliery screens, was entering a labor market that had more safeguards than his grandfather had known. The safeguards were still imperfect, accidents continued to occur, the work was still dangerous. The education the boy had received before starting work at the colliery was still more limited than what middle-class children received. But the difference from 1840 was real and significant. In the market towns and smaller industrial centers of England, the pattern of child labor was more varied and less directly addressed by the factory legislation, which was primarily designed with large-scale industrial establishments in mind. Market Town in the West Midlands might have a variety of small workshops producing different goods, a tannery at the edge of town, a corn mill beside the river, a brickworks on the edge of the built-up area, and a number of craftsmen's premises distributed through the town centre. The children who worked in these various small enterprises were not easily reached by the factory inspectorate, which focused its visits on the larger establishments. The Workshops Act of 1867 had extended some of the Factory Act provisions to smaller workplaces, but enforcement in small workshops was difficult and often nominal. A small workshop with half a dozen workers, including a couple of children, was less visible and less accessible to inspection than a mill employing 500 people. The master who ran such a workshop might comply with the letter of the law when an inspector came round and revert to previous practices. Otherwise, the children working in such places were embedded in a patron-client relationship with their master that made it difficult for them to complain about conditions, even when conditions warranted complaint. The apprenticeship system, which in its formal regulated version had provided some protection for child workers in skilled trades by specifying the terms of the master's obligations to the apprentice, had become increasingly informal by the mid-Victorian period in many trades. The old guild regulations that had governed apprenticeship had largely collapsed with the rise of industrial capitalism, and the new regulatory framework around factory employment did not adequately replace what had been lost. Children who entered trades as informal apprentices or as errand boys and general assistants occupied a position that was difficult to categorize and difficult to regulate. The social geography of the Victorian city meant that these varied patterns of child employment existed within a few streets of each other. In a street in the East End of London in 1870, one might find children going to school in the morning, children heading to the match factory for a half-time shift, children setting up their street trading pitches, and children helping in a small workshop at the back of a house or within the same block. The diversity of working-class urban life expressed itself partly through the diversity of ways in which children contributed to household economies. The documentation of this diversity improved substantially over the course of the Victorian period. The census returns, which became more detailed and more consistently recorded from 1841 onward, included the occupations of children, where those were known to the heads of household who filled out the returns. The school attendance records that school boards maintained from 1870 onward provided another source of information about which children were in school and which were absent. The records of charitable organizations, hospitals, and courts added further detail. Together, these sources allow historians to trace the changing patterns of child employment with a degree of precision that is not possible for earlier periods. What these sources reveal when examined across the decades from 1840 to 1900 is a story of gradual but unmistakable change. The proportion of children under 10 in paid employment fell significantly over this period. The proportion of children attending school regularly rose. The industries employing the largest numbers of children, textiles and mining, saw the regulatory restrictions tighten and be more effectively enforced. The very worst features of the early industrial system, pauper apprentices in distant mills, children employed in the most dangerous underground work from the age of 5 or 6. Climbing boys in narrow chimney flues were either eliminated or greatly reduced. The story is not one of linear progress uninterrupted by setbacks. Economic downturns put pressure on working-class households and increased the temptation to send children into the labor market regardless of legal restrictions. Periods of rapid industrial expansion created demand for labor that drew children back into the workforce. The half-time system, while a genuine compromise between work and education, was also a way of preserving a form of child labor within a legal framework that gave it legitimacy. The persistence of agricultural child labor well into the 20th century was a reminder that the reforms of the Victorian era had not reached every corner of the economy. But taken as a whole, the century between 1840 and 1940 saw a transformation in the relationship between childhood and labor in Britain that was fundamental. A child born in 1900 could expect to spend the first 14 years of their life primarily in school, with limited contributions to household labor and no entry into the regulated labor market until their early teens. A child born in 1840 had no such expectation. The difference represented an enormous change in the ordinary texture of childhood. A change that was produced by legislative reform, economic development, educational expansion, and a slow cultural shift in how childhood itself was understood. In the early morning light of a Lancashire mill town, in the final years of the 19th century, the mills were still there, still running, still producing the cloth that had made Lancashire famous across the world. But the children who entered the gates were fewer than they had been, and older, and their time inside the gates was shorter. And on the other days of the week, many of them sat in schoolrooms rather than at spinning frames. The machinery had not changed its fundamental nature. The mills were still mills. But the world around them had changed in ways that were quiet and incremental and, taken together, significant. A boy or girl walking to the mill in 1895 would have been 14 or close to it, entering work at an age when earlier generations of mill workers had already been employed for years. They might have completed the standard elementary curriculum. They might be able to read a newspaper, write a letter, do basic arithmetic. They walked into a workplace that had inspectors and regulations and hours restrictions in ways that their grandparents' workplace had not. The work was still tiring. The hours were still long by the standards of a professional occupation. The mill itself was still noisy, still warm, still producing its endless length of cloth. But the life waiting for that young worker was materially different from what had waited for Thomas in 1843. The records stop, and the machines continue to turn in the imagination, and the town settles into the rhythms of an ordinary Victorian afternoon in the final decades of a century that had changed more than most centuries before it. The streets outside the mills fill with the ordinary business of a working town. Women carrying baskets, delivery carts moving along cobbled roads, children released from school making their slow way home. The clocks in the mill towers keep the time that structures everything: the shifts, the meals, the school hours, the market days. The town is contained within its own routines, and the routines are the visible surface of all the slow changes that have accumulated over the decades, each one small, the sum of them significant.